I think we can perhaps begin. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Andres Tutoy, Director of the Institute for Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you both physically and virtually to this last academic seminar and webinar on power relations in the wine value chain in South Africa. It's a great pleasure to welcome all of you here, but also to welcome our guests, long-time friends and colleagues of PLOS, Professor Stefano Ponte, Professor of International Political Economy from the Copenhagen Business School. Stefano has been doing work for many years, kind of troubling the ways in which people try to codify and operationalize ethics in transnational agricultural trade. He's worked on coffee, he's worked on wine, and I don't know when he's going to get to the creme brulees and the cheese, but through the elite menus of the world. And Rina Dosner, professor at University of Johannesburg, long-time researcher at the Center for Competition, Regulation, Economic Development, has been doing really interesting and path-breaking work on competition in the grocery sector, transnational agri-food networks in Southern Africa, also work of great interest to PLOS. And it's really good to hear you share with us your thoughts and your findings about your, in a way, return to a topic you've been doing quite a lot of work in the past. We will have about half an hour of presentation, and then the floor will be open for questions. Those of you who are virtually present, please put your questions in the chat, and we will collect them at the end. After the presentation, we'll go to questions and answers, and we'll finish at 2 p.m. Without any more ado, over to you, Stefano and Rina.
Thank you, Andres, and thanks for the invitation. And thank you for setting up this thing physically and remotely. I know hybrid events are not always the easiest thing to do, so we're very much appreciative. I'm going to start sharing the presentation. Hopefully it will work. It looks like it does. Okay. Rina and I have been doing work in the Western Cape for the past 4 weeks, which is a very short time, but it's exploratory work for a project that is going to keep us longer around these areas. And the overall project is on power and inequality in global production systems, and this particular bit is focused on the South African value chain. So we're still in the middle of field work, so you're thinking, so these guys, coming here to tell us things before they finish. Well, the whole idea is actually to also get feedback from you partly on the analytical approach that we have, and partly to share some very preliminary observations. So these are not results in any way, but also to be part of that conversation with PLOS, which has done through various researchers, including Andres, a lot of path-breaking work in this field, also on wine, also on BE, and especially on land issues, which are coming quite importantly, of course, in the path of transformation. Let's see. Trying to change slide. Just going a bit slowly, but it's coming. So the overall project is actually on power and inequality global production systems. It's not only on wine, we're also working on fish, and we're working in South Africa and Chile. On fish, we've done some work in the past 2 years together with Thando Vilakazi, who's also the director of CRED and UJ, where Reina is affiliated. And with wine, in addition to Reina, we're also working with Shingi Shizoro, also from CRED. So the overall research questions are the ones that we are showing here. How do different combinations of power shape the functioning of global production systems, equals global value chains over time? In what circumstances do these combinations yield increasing or decreasing inequalities, and what kind of inequalities? And what policies and strategies can be devised in view of addressing these existing inequalities? Very often, policy work is based on either no understanding of the power relations or only one way of looking at power relations. So our argument is that in order to do better policy, also we need to understand the various, with finesse, the various layers of different kinds of power relations that are at play in an industry and along the value chain. It's a bit slower in changing, so please. There you go. It did it. All right. So theoretically, we draw from an analytical framework that I developed with some colleagues, Mark Dallas and Tim Sturgeon. The original publication came out in 2019, and it's really about different kinds of power in global value chains. We have a framework that essentially divides up different kinds of power by the type of power transmission. So power transmission can be direct. So I tell you to do something, you do it. And indirect is, there may be hints around about how it could be best done. And it's not a direct kind of relationship, but there is a general understanding between the parties into a transaction that transmit this kind of power, not directly, but more diffusely. And I'll come a little bit more into that in a second. And then there is different arenas of actors that are subjected or are the agent of this power. One is dyadic, so between one-to-one in companies between themselves or government companies, and the other one is collective. So among collectives of that includes institutions, but they can also be industry associations and stakeholder initiatives in which power is exercised. Our original take was that we need to have these different differentiations in the way in which we understand power in global value chains, so supply chains dynamics, because most of the work that has been done out there is essentially on bargaining power, which is direct and dyadic. It's an important part. A lot of really good work has been done on especially showing how powerful supermarket chains are rolling down demands and standards all the way to the value chain, all the way to the farmer throughout the various passages. And a lot of very good political science and political economy work has been done in institutional power, which is direct and collective, in terms of understanding how regulation operates. Our friends at Credit are very good at that. Or how power is being leveraged through industrial standards or other even platform-oriented institutional transmission mechanisms. So bargaining power, institutional power, done by usually different literatures with different foci. What we are trying to develop is the other side, in which there are more sociological and ideational elements of power that come into play. So, and this is work that we've been doing the past 15, 20 years with other colleagues, but it wasn't put together in this way, and we're trying to make sense of it in this 2x2 figure. So diffuse power is demonstrative power is dyadic and diffuse, in the sense that it's still about two actors that are interacting in one way or another at the individual level. But instead of being direct transmission of power, it operates through informal transmission mechanisms, copying, mimicry, second guessing what the other person wants or the other party in a transaction wants. And it is shaped by quality conventions or by copying what others are doing. So I am, for example, the supplier of a particular wine to a buyer, and then I see that other suppliers with their own buyers are changing it or doing something different. And I copy that because I think that is the future of where the market will go. Nobody's telling me to do anything. I am mimicking, I'm copying. I am guessing that that is the way in which the market is going, or I'm guessing that there is something that the buyer will want from me. So again, these are sociological sort of transmission mechanisms that are more diffuse. And then the bottom part is, on the bottom right, is constitutive power. This is the same kind of diffuse mechanisms, but they come into a collective arena. So these are about general, acceptable understandings, legitimate ways of doing things that collectively an industry think is the best way of doing transformation, or redistributing land, or setting up a BE deal, or understanding what sustainability is like. These are very difficult to trace historically. I've written this book trying to do that. It's called Business Power and Sustainability. Just came out in 19. And this work is essentially trying to build on this book together with my colleagues in really getting into more depth on how to unpeel these various layers of power and how this looks all very generic because the theory should be generic, but then how do we then do it in practice? How do we peel the various layers? How do we understand when something is becoming constitutive in a sense that everybody is accepting them, even though there may not be a rule in place that tells us that that is the way to do it? Or it started as a rule, institutional, but then it becomes accepted more generally. So that is the area within which theoretically we are trying to operate. What does it mean in wine? I'll give you some examples. So when we look at bargaining power, this more classic way of looking at power. We look at dyadic and direct forms. So we look at how power is exercised by individual firms. That could be a winery, it could be a retailer, it could be a farmer. In terms of control of assets, so land, winemaking facilities, we learned water rights. Recently, it hasn't even come into this. Access to capital or access to markets. It could be, and therefore we look also at contractual relations between suppliers and buyers. Who is, how do you get to a price point? How do you, is there a bargain in place? Or is it always that the buyer can actually set down the terms of the transaction, and that is that. So a lot of this work has been done for quite a long time, and we continue on that because it's of course important. Institutional power, so it's collective and direct. In this case, we look at how the state exercises influence in the way in which the value chain for wine is shaped through the regulation and scorecards, land distribution efforts, and otherwise. Import regulations, for example, the Scandinavian monopolies have been absolutely essential in pushing a sustainability, a very particular way of doing sustainability in the wine industry. Because if you want to sell to Finland, Sweden, Norway, and also in some states in Canada, you have to go through this kind of scorecard exercise that has a lot of various elements in social and environmental sustainability. But this power can also be exercised the other way around with industry association lobbying or doing advocacy work, for example, to tame some of the regulatory pressure that comes from the state. In sustainability also, certification agencies and NGOs are very active in trying to make the industry look more, or be more green and more socially inclusive. There's a lot of this going on in South Africa in particular. It's a very interesting area of analysis. So when we go on the diffuse side, then we were talking about peer-to-peer diffusion between various individual actors on the ownership models. Oh, these guys have done it this way. I'm going to try to do the same because it seems to be working okay, or not working, or working for certain groups or not others. Different business models. There's a lot of walking away from lands, grape farming. It used to be very good to be vertically integrated. You grow your own grapes, especially for the higher quality side, and make your own wine. Now, land is always a problem. There's a lot of there are issues with capital, there are issues with ownership, and all that. So, and this is percolating along the value chain. Others are adopting or copying other models that they see around. So, ideas and practices on sustainability, quality, branding, the whole thing. Constitutive power then becomes this collectivization of these understandings and copying mechanisms that are pushed from one-to-one interactions, but also institutionally from various NGOs and industry associations and of course government, and shapes generally accepted idea of what transformation is in the wine industry, what sustainability is, what are successful business models, approaches to quality, branding, competition, etc. This is the big picture, okay? I'm not saying that we're doing all of this, but we are actually at this point really trying to fill the bits in the four places in order then to look more carefully in terms of which methods are we going to use, what secondary sources can we use to measure these things, in addition to the interview data we have, the secondary data, and then the way in which we analyze, for example, website images and messages that come from it. Very briefly, and then I'll turn it to the more interesting part where Mina is going to tell us how it is actually working. By inequality, okay, inequality is a big word in the sense there are very many different ways of looking at inequality. And I'm not saying that we are doing all of this, but we are aware of the different kinds in which inequality can be looked at in a value chain perspective. So again, we're very narrowly looking at supply chain perspective. And so we have in this paper that is actually out for review together with a PhD student of mine, Juliana Lang, who's working in Chile, and myself and Tando Vilakazi, we did this kind of mapping exercise. And so we have this kind of division on three ways in which we can look at inequality. Inequality that is manifested at the same node in the value chain. So we focus, for example, on winemaking, and then look at different firms, different groups of firms, whether they're women-driven, whether they are transformed or not, and therefore try to understand whether there is a different way in which value added is created and appropriated in different groups, in different firms, or different social groups that are operating at one node. Say, for example, labor, but depending on gender or ethnicity or nationality, can do it in many different ways. So that's one way of focusing on one node and do a more classic, I would say, quote unquote, inequality analysis. In value chain analysis, we usually do work in this middle area in which we look at various nodes, and either we look at similar social groups or companies and how they are doing in terms of profitability and employment in different nodes. So at the grape production level, or at winemaking, at branding, and exporting, and retailing, and then we have a distribution of value added along the chain, and we make some observation on that. But it can also be by looking at similar groups in different nodes. So you can look at labor, and how is labor faring in the farm? How is labor faring in the wine cellar? How is labor faring in the export and branding promotion, et cetera, et cetera. And then the third part is through chains, which is more of a political economy, broadly speaking, discourses or analysis of inequality, in which inequality itself is manifested through the interactions in the chain as a way of organizing the economy. And what does that mean in terms of inequality, in terms of economic or environmental or social impacts? And so it is about the more systemic way of looking at relations between capital and labor, between capital and nature, and all of that. And that is the harder one to really kind of measure in a more kind of mainstream social science way. But we are aware of these three ways. Global value chain analysis has been quite good at doing the one in the middle. Other social science and development studies people are very good at doing the one on the left in terms of at the same node, and PLAS has been part of that debate as well as the more kind of the sort of broader political economy take on inequality through chains. We're not going to be able to say anything about the industry today on this because we haven't gotten really the data or reflected upon that. So what we do today is really to give you an idea of what the bits and pieces that we picked up that are important now, and that we hope to bring into this framework eventually in terms of analytical sort of guidance, and in terms of framing the way in which we want to then organize the results. I talked a bit too long, sorry.
Not a problem. Should we swap seats?
I think that the camera should Okay.
Does it come on?
Yeah, but I think it's because of the works. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Stefano. And thank you, Andres, for the invitation and to PLAS for hosting us. So I'm going to talk about some of the preliminary trends that we're seeing, just to emphasize that we've just started the research. So we have to really dig into the data a lot more, and we have to continue with our field work, and we plan to come back to continue with that. So this is just a picture from some of the interviews that we've done and some of the data that's publicly available. To highlight, we haven't done interviews at the farm level in this phase. So we're looking to come back to do that. This is also linked to another project that CRED is doing, looking at women on farms and women along the wine value chain. So we'll be back for interviews on that later. So some of the general trends that we're seeing, that there's been a decrease in the area under vines. However, wine production has increased. So we've just got some figures between 2005, the last time Stefano was here, and 2020. And this indicates that there is an increase in yields. So more being produced while less grapes, more wine being produced, even though there's less grapes grown. We're also seeing the number of wine producers decreasing, and digging into that data a little bit deeper, we see that it's particularly smaller producers that are sort of falling away, and the number of larger producers increasing. So you're seeing a trend towards consolidation. And I don't think this is very surprising. In many different agro-processing industries, both internationally and in South Africa, we are seeing this increase in concentration trend. Quite interesting for us was the competition for alternative crops. So instead of growing grapes for wine production, farmers it might be more profitable to grow high value crops such as fruit, for example, cut flowers, etc. So there's this constant sort of tension in terms of, farmers that are happy to continue growing grapes for wine production versus changing up their crops to high value fruit. And this obviously has implications for the industry going forward. So that's something we'd like to look at a little bit more closely. We're also seeing a reduced number of producer sellers and private sellers, but we're seeing a trend of increasing wholesalers. Now, wholesalers in this context are operations that buy either produced wine from other wineries or buy grapes and process it into their own brands. So it's interesting to see this development of a new model and more players. Perhaps not a new model, but it's certainly gaining more traction in recent years. So we'd like to look into that a little bit more as well. In terms of export markets, traditionally strong in Europe, but we are seeing increasing exports to China and other Asian markets. There's also quite an exciting trend towards increasing exports into other African countries, which is something that we'd like to explore more. At the moment, it appears to be at the value offering and not the premium wine offering, but that's something to look at. However, the UK is still quite a strong export market for a lot of South African wines. There's also growing exports of bulk relative to bottled. And why this is interesting and why I've raised this is because bulk is obviously considered, or bulk wines are considered cheaper. They're perceived as more value and not at the premium level. And this has had implications on how South Africa has been perceived. South African wine has been perceived internationally. So it's created this tension with positioning, if you like. So there's a perception that South African wine is not of the high quality of other wines globally. But we are nonetheless seeing this trend increasing in terms of bulk wine exports. It is important to have bulk wine exports because that's where your volume comes from. So it's important that that happens for the sustainability of the industry. Quite difficult to change the perception of being sort of a low or a value market. You would need multiple awards on your wines, or wine critics giving you very high scores for various things in order to change this perception. But this could be a challenge going forward in trying to appear to produce more premium wines. Then a lot of the people that we interviewed, of course, spoke about the impact of COVID on the supply chain. Massive impact. Oversupply because of supply chain bottlenecks. Of course, there were the alcohol bans that prevented sales. And I think pretty much across the board, the massive shipping challenges were raised by everyone because a lot of the players we interviewed export. Cape Town harbor problems, not being used to capacity, various delays, lack of containers, vessels completely bypassing Cape Town, creating massive backlogs. and escalating shipping rates. We have very few global shipping lines that control availability and cost of containers. At a local level, bottle shortages were raised. We have a monopoly supply of glass bottles in South Africa, and this caused, for various supply chain constraints, caused difficulties in terms of availability. With regards to sustainability, which is a key area of focus for us, we're continuing to research various social and environmental sustainability efforts. On the social side, of course, you'll be well aware there are various concerns around living conditions, wages of farm workers, and community upliftments. The interview suggests that there are a lot of firm level initiatives that are attempting to deal with these. There are also industry initiatives and projects that we want to explore in more detail. There's VITA, the Ethical Wine and Agriculture Ethical Trading Associations, and another project, Pebbles Project, which is doing a lot for our communities related to wine production. We want to try and understand, as part of our power, our understanding of different forms of power, to what extent export markets, for example, in Scandinavia, are an important driver of these standards in South Africa. So is it a requirement to meet certain ethical standards, and to what degree do they affect operations in South Africa adhering to these standards? And on the environmental side, of course, there is quite a novel and unique seal that we have in South Africa, which is part of the Integrated Production of Wine, IPW, which is a voluntary standard, but it complies with several international standards as well, and it covers quite a big proportion of vineyards in South Africa and wine production. So this is a movement, in the right direction in terms of environmental sustainability. And South Africa is unique rather in this approach, as one of the first countries in the world with the seal. So that if you see a little green seal on wine bottles bottled in South Africa, you have a guarantee of certain practices and traceability along the value chain, etc. There are also interesting conservation efforts through WWF Conservation Champions and various firm level practices such as biodynamic and organic farms. But this is it's not of course widespread, but there are certain pockets of farms that practice this. Of course, all of these different standards mean various compliance requirements and multiple audits. So this places costs onto those that want to adhere to these standards, and it could be a challenge, particularly for new players in the market, to be able to adhere to these various audits. But in general, these are seen as valuable for the industry. I think I'm running out of time.
I'll skip the last one. So
Okay.
You finish what you
I think I have two more important points to make, and then I'll hand back over to Stefano. Around transformation. So this is another area that we're looking at. There is a statutory levy with a proportion that's reserved for transformation in the industry. But from a very preliminary review of the industry, transformation has been quite limited, particularly at the growing level, at the farm level. And a lot of this has been attributed to the very, very slim margins at the farm level. So again, if you recall, I mentioned that farmers might be tempted to move into higher value crops and move away from grape farming altogether, given very slim margins. The land issues, the water right issues appear to be obviously major challenges in this regard, as well as a lack of skills with regards to running an integrated operation, or running at least an operation at the farm level if it's not vertically integrated. We've heard of some worker ownership schemes that have also faced substantial challenges, and we'd really like to understand this a little bit deeper, because if we're thinking of transformation as ownership, change in ownership, we'd like to understand what these challenges are and what potential policy tools there might be to help address some of these challenges. What's quite interesting is the different models that are emerging at the production level. So a lot of these challenges I've spoken about are at the growing level for the growing of grapes, but at the production level, this concept of virtual wineries seems to be quite an interesting concept, where you don't have to own the land or the assets, for example, bottling and production, and it potentially then lowers barriers to entry because you can circumvent needing these assets. However, you still need to build a brand. So you still have to sell your brand. You need access to markets. You might not have all the overheads of all the assets, but if you can't get your products to markets, then it's unlikely to succeed. So we've been looking at the work of industry bodies like the South Africa Wine Transformation Units and what they are doing to support Black farmers and Black entrepreneurs along various different nodes of the wine value chain. And lastly, I don't think I could speak at a seminar if I don't talk about retailers. I mean, as Andres has said, this has been my area of work for many years. And I've just got some early observations on the bargaining power of retailers. And here we've largely, at this point in time, we've looked at retailers and export destinations. And there has been some indication of buyer power or bargaining power of your large supermarket chains and export markets. So for example, in various supermarket chains in Europe, UK, etc. Indication of different types of fees that are charged, listing fees, rebates, promotional, advertising fees, etc. And this is from the information that we've got where wine producers sell directly to retailers. Often it doesn't go directly to retailers in export markets, it goes through agents and intermediaries. But we are seeing very similar kinds of practices to what we've seen in our past research at CRED with regards to South African supermarkets when we researched other processed food value chains. So there is a degree of power, particularly on the value level of the market, where margins are very, very thin. The retailers do tend to be able to squeeze margins from suppliers, and that is a function of how small the margins are as well. There is an interesting difference between the relative bargaining power between value and premium wines, but perhaps not surprising. Those that sell premium wines have a brand, and they can use that brand power to negotiate lower fees, lower rebates, lower promotional fees, for example. So that's quite interesting to see that. On the private label side, where perhaps we export in bulk and it gets rebottled in the export destination, but not under the brand name of the South African producer, maybe under the supermarket's name or a generic name, there's less bargaining power because there are fewer outside options. If the retailer decides to drop you, who are you going to sell your wine to? So there seems to be less bargaining power there. We also want to really understand how the retailers drive sustainability. Are they insisting on ethical standards? Are they insisting on ethical work conditions on the farm at various levels of the value chain? Are they insisting on environmental standards? So we're trying to see whether retailers are driving that. And while this might be good for the consumer, what does it mean in terms of shifting costs and risks to producers? Does that not put, or does it put a greater burden on producers to meet all these costs of auditing, etc., of meeting these requirements? So these are all questions that we're still trying to answer, but I think we've got a good base from this set of interviews. I'm going to hand back to Stefan.
Very briefly, this is just the first step, really. We're going to be coming back to fieldwork, and also we'll be participating in the Cape Wine Expo in October. As part of the other project, there will be a lot more work on at the farm level, interviews, then comparative work both within South Africa, within the fish and the wine industries, and then which there's some interesting inequality dynamics and differences in the two countries that are quite important to look at. But I think I'll just stop here. I think we need to have time, adequate time for question and answer. Thank you for your attention, and I'll stop sharing.
Thank you. Thank you. We have had quite a lot of questions already from some of the 46 online participants. So with your permission, shall I just put those out for the two of you to deal with, and then we'll take another round of questions from the physically present. Of course, and then if there are more questions from the online participants, we'll go back to them. So there's a question from Daniel Ikechumo in Nigeria. Sorry, I didn't bring my glasses yet, so you want to abide with me for a second. Who is asking about the extent of attempts in the industry to ensure good devices for checking the difference between fake and original wines, and to what extent is this a problem in the industry? Particularly in the context of alarming health risks in this period of time. Then there is a question asking you to elaborate on the challenges experienced by the share equity and worker ownership schemes that you just alluded to in passing. Louisa from Berlin asks you to elaborate on the sources, the theoretical foundations of your typology of kind of power. She suspects that Stephen Luke's is in there somewhere, but she couldn't really make out exactly how these different dimensions are set out. And what is the advantages of this particular conceptualization of power for work you're trying to do here? And then Refule Joala asks a question about the impact of consolidation on wine prices. And to what extent has consolidation improved the bargaining power of producers in highly competitive bulk wine international markets? And then finally, no, there's more. Can I keep on going?
Just a couple of them, and then we'll do another round.
There's a question about buyer bargaining power. Elsenberg has undertaken research with Casidra, which is the Rural Development Unit, which showed how international purchasers insist on retail accreditation, but are not necessarily willing to increase the wholesale price that they pay. So nothing's changed there, it sounds like, for South African wine. And I think this is a question for you to, this is a comment, more of a comment question, but please, if you want to respond to that. And then Rita from Bochum, Germany asks about differences in bargaining power between value and premium wines. What about the fact that producers often produce both value and premium? Is that not the case in South Africa as well? So there's quite an interesting mix of theoretical and very complex empirical questions for you to deal with. I don't know, Rina, do you want to start? And then,
Sure. So I may not have got everybody's name, sorry, so I'll try and just read the notes now. I think it was Daniel from Nigeria around, how do you handle counterfeit, I think was the for quality wine. I think, and this is obviously something we're going to look at much more closely, but the IPW accreditation, which allows full traceability of the wine from the production of the grape, gives some sort of comfort around the quality standards along the value chain. So I think the more players that have the IPW seal, that kind of protects from this particular concern. But having said that, I do recognize there's an entire informal segment in which there are concerns around informally produced or wine, if I can call it that. But yeah, so some of this, in a nutshell, some of this accreditations help towards easing that problem. I think then there was another question around the buyer power issues. Stefan, if you don't mind, I can talk about that, where the supermarket's insisting on accreditation, but they're not willing to change their price. I think this is particularly a problem in the value segment, again, where the margins are quite slim. And it's this question about how much of the cost and risks of accreditation are being passed to the supplier, and what does this mean for the supplier's margins? And we would have to look at this in a little bit more detail, but we have heard that this is a concern. So they're demanding all these accreditations, but not willing to pay the higher price for it. So it might be a question about perhaps the branding of South African wines, within that value segment. Is there a way of kind of is there a need to move up that into the more premium wines, but it's not always possible because of the volumes. But it's something that's interesting, and we need to understand that as part of our understanding of power. The differences in bargaining power at the value and premium level, and the question was, I think, around a lot of suppliers supply both. And I think there were some interesting insights that came out about the benefits of supplying a portfolio of wines. So you have supplying the value side of wines, or a certain range in the value side, and also the premium. And we're seeing that kind of offering might be quite attractive in international markets, and that might well give the supplier a little bit more bargaining power. But these are things that we are just at the tip of the iceberg. We have to look at in a lot more detail. Stefan, I'm not sure if you want to add to that.
I think you answered most of them very well. I just wanted to add a little bit on the bargaining power by buyers, and the fact that Vita is becoming part of, and IPW is becoming part of what many of these buyers want to have. And very often that is, as in many other sustainability certifications, that is now being taken for granted because the whole industry, almost the whole industry, complies with these basic standards. It isn't a source of differentiation. It's a source of making sure that the most egregious issues in relation to environment and social are supposed to be taken care of, and we can talk about how that is done in practice, but that's another discussion. But that will not allow you to say, well, I have this, therefore, can we talk about that in the premium, because everybody else has it as well. So this is becoming part of what I have argued in previous work of a green supplier squeeze, when I was focusing on the environment, in which there is more and more, there are more and more demands from supermarket chains and indirectly from consumers about having green products. But there is no willingness, certainly a very limited one from the retail side, to pay a premium price for it, with some exceptions. Fair trade, organics are part of that exception, but for many of the other certifications, they become part of this demand. This is the quality, this is the packaging, this is the delivery time, these are the financial terms, and that's that. And then you add the social and environmental issues. So there is more to be delivered for the same price, and in some cases, of course, better environmental management, social management in the long term can pay off. You run a better business, you may reduce cost on energy, and therefore in the long term you may actually become a better business. But in the short term, very often there are increased costs involved and capital intensive investments in some of these. And therefore there is also a divide within the industry more generally on wineries that are part of larger diversified group, or they are part of wealthy family or individual kind of properties in which they can play around and throw a lot of money at it. There's nothing wrong with that in particular, but if you had to make money out of that particular property, you wouldn't be able to do it that way. And so the people who are full-time in wine and don't have other things, they are sort of, well, yeah, sure, they can do that. We can't, because we have to be profitable as a unit. And so there is a divide in that perspective as well. But there is a little bit of a sense of getting more out of also environmental and social standards, and demanding more from that. On the theoretical foundations of the typology of power, I'm less inclined to spend a lot of time on this now, but in general, what we're trying, first of all, is the typology of power for value chain analysis, not for economic activity in general. We built upon what we were seeing were the limitations of looking at power relations in the value chain, which were essentially limited to drawing from theoretical perspectives to look into bargaining power and institutional power, essentially from institutional economics and parts of institutionalist political science and cognate approaches. I and some other, many others have also drawn in from a lot more now from economic sociology in order to understand the less direct or more diffuse forms of power. A lot of work that we have done to build up on this is from convention theory, for example, which is a sort of a French inspired school of economic sociology. So when we were trying to put all of this together, not in order to say, well, these four boxes are separate, but to say, well, in any condition, in any industry, or you look at a particular point in an industry, these may overlap and they have different sources. And therefore, if you are only trying to address, for example, bargaining power, you don't understand that there is a battle of ideas there, then you're missing some of the opportunities for example, alleviating some of the inequalities or the unequal power balance. I'm going to stop at that. I think we took care of most of the others. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there questions in the room before we go back to this? There are many more questions coming in from online, but maybe there are questions from our physical participants. Martha?
No, thanks. Came on detail and where do you see similarities with fisheries? Is it for example, in the certification schemes like Marine Stewardship Council, or overproduction in aquaculture, which is causing problems?
Can you repeat the start of the question?
Overproduction in aquaculture.
Overproduction in aquaculture.
Yeah, for example, at a certain stage, the Norwegians had to cut back in the production of salmon because the price was, there was oversupply in the market. And also the Chinese and Vietnamese for the aquaculture species that they normally export to Europe and North America. And also, how are there labor issues, for example, on the farm, and also on the like tuna vessels, where they keep people more or less like slaves for months on end. So what are the linkages you see between fisheries and wine?
Thank you. Any other questions from our physically present participants? If I may, I want to throw something into the pot. I'm very much aware of how this picture contrasts with what some of the hopes were early in the discussion on ethical monitoring of value chains, where there was a very strong focus on social conditions of farm labor and the sort of notion that you could, through the mechanisms of traceability, get a lever to positively impact farm labor relations on the ground. And it seems to me there are two shifts you're describing here, which are cause for worry in that regard. The one is, I'm getting the impression from what you say that environmental issues carry more weight and are at the top of the list for consumers and buyers overseas, and that the social conditions are more and more becoming even more of an add-on than they were in the past. And secondly, when you talk about these virtual wineries, to what extent do they serve to undermine the possibility of direct traceability? If I expose conditions of work on, say, the farm Hartenberg, whose label is on their wine, there's a real risk for them in there. But if I have some imaginary estate which buys their wine, the grapes on the open market, or even their wine and lenses, what happens to the kind of leverage that one can exercise through ethical trading and similar codes?
Okay, thank you, Martha. I knew you were coming in with the fish side, and it makes sense because I mean the overall project is a comparative project, and so the original idea to do fish and wine started really the reflection in the South African, particularly in the South African case, that in both industries you had a lot of focus on environmental issues, so Marine Stewardship Council, IPW in wine. On labor issues, though, MSC doesn't cover labor issues, so those have been sort of left out of the sustainability discussion. And as a matter of fact, there isn't really much of a discussion at all. One in wine, because of the farm labor situation, there have been, and I understand that I'm not trying to answer your point as well, but they're still very much on the plate. Whether they are subservient to environmental or not, I'm not quite sure. I'm also trying not to becoming, because I've done a lot of work on environment, I tend to perhaps portray it in stronger terms because I know more about it, rather than the situation on the ground. So there's that issue. So in trying to understand what is carrying what there. And on the transformation side in South Africa, the whole idea was that in theory, you should have seen major transformational change in fisheries because the government owns the quotas at the end of the day. And there is, as you well know, this whole process every 15 years or so. It's just been going on. And that's the work that we did in the last 2 years to try to understand what that means for competition and for what it means for transformation. If you read the transformational scores in the fishing industry, at a surface level, it looks like they've done a very good job. And if you go beyond the ownership side, the pure ownership part, and you understand the way in which various contractual relations are put together, then we go back to where we were more or less in the early 2000s. So it's a very contentious sort of area. But in theory, that is the place where we were supposed to see a lot of change. In wine, at least originally, in addition to the land redistribution issues, there wasn't so much of that pull because land is in private hands, the wine market is a private market. Yes, the Scandinavians have put in some things that they like to see. But now I actually think that there is more leverage in the wine industry than we thought. And that is an interesting new thing in the sense that there are various ways in which the BE scorecards are at various places, especially on the retailer side, but also in other places in which, in order for them to get certain profiles, they need to have better scores on, especially on procurement, on small enterprises, and if you can, on ownership as well. Very different situations in different property profiles, because if you have a very large conglomerate, then usually you do have a BE partner. If you have a family business in the wine industry, it's much more difficult to go that route. There is also the EU South Africa trade agreement that has set aside funding for transformation. There's the Systembolaget, so the Swedes and the monopolies who are scoring on all these things. Then there is liquor license allocations that also can be used for that purpose. So this is something new that I picked up. There are at least 4 or 5 different elements that are not like one big one, like the fisheries, that are eating at the side and trying to push for transformation. Obviously, if you look at the record in the 2 indices, as one would expect, that the record is quite different. And when we talk to people who are involved in this, they are aware that, especially on the land issue, the movement has been really, really small in terms of change in ownership. But she will tell you more about this since we are getting into the second point.
Great, thanks. I think just probably building on what Stefano said, it's probably not our intention to suggest that the environmental issues carry more weight necessarily, or are top of the list, and some of the social issues are further down. I think that's not our intention. And from what we've seen so far, this might not necessarily be the case at all. For example, again, the Scandinavian monopoly, Canada, for example, there's certain export destinations that are placing a lot of weight on the social conditions as well. So I think there is increased demand for both on the social demand for ethically traded and sourced and produced products, as well as on the environmental side. Which one takes more weight? I don't think at this stage we're able to tell. Then I think, Andres, you asked about the virtual winery model, which is something that I'm also very interested in. And is that a way in which, because elements are sourced from various third-party providers, is that a way in which one can almost hide behind some of the ethical requirements, ethical trading requirements, and environmental requirements? Again, the way my understanding of some of these accreditations is that it's right up until the point of bottling. So it requires full traceability, even if you buy grapes from third parties. That farm has to be accredited accordingly. The relevant audits are done on that farm. Similarly for your bottling facility. So I think if these accreditations become as widespread as they're already fairly widespread, that might make it difficult to hide behind contracts in various parties. Stefan, I'm not sure if you have anything to add on that.
I think on the virtual winery model, I think it's an interesting one. There's a lot of discussion on this, okay? Because I mean, there are the corners of observers, also researchers saying, no, I mean, this should be about the land. This should be about capital. It should be about ownership of the wineries and the land. Then you talk and you get a little bit more of an understanding of the profitability profile of grape farming for wine. Then you start saying, well, is it really that are we trying to push to have people who weren't having access to land to do something that is not very profitable. And there is questions that we need to ask ourselves into that. That does not mean that they should actually stay with that, with grapes or wine. So the other thing is that in some of these schemes, worker-owned schemes, that they actually switched to doing something else that is more profitable, whether that is real estate development or other farming activities. That's actually an interesting trend. So what I'm saying here is that the industry is pushing back, saying, well, why would you want to give land when nobody wants land now for grape farming for wine, because there is very little money to be made. And on the other hand, it's like, well, okay, but that land can also be used for other ways, for other purposes. So why not? So that is part of the debate that we are hearing there. Parallel to that, then there is the entrepreneurs, the wine makers from previously advantaged backgrounds that are going to Stellenbosch universities. They are going out to make their own wines now. Basically booking a space in the cellar, buying grapes from other farmers, and having a third-party bottler put on their brand and sell it. And okay, in terms of employment, generation is not that great, but there's a group of these entrepreneurs that are finding that way of marketing. I think there is space for that as well, and I don't think that it is our place to say, well, why would they do that? It's more important to have the farms. There's not either or. Is more of a complex setup. I know that when I say land, then Ruth wants to say something. So.
Actually, it's not on land.
Okay.
Thank you so much. So interesting. Now, I remember some years ago, and it was around the time of the farm workers' strike. We had Stephanie Barrientos and who was a co-author? Can't remember. Presenting here the findings of their study called Capturing the Gains. Yes. And that was on table grapes. Yeah. But the table grapes industry was the center of the farm workers' strike. And what they showed us was a pie chart. And what we were seeing was the distribution of the value of South African table grapes retailed through British supermarkets. So, and the point being made there, of course, is that the struggles around minimum wages here between labor and capital were around that 18% share that stays at farm, or 25% farm gate price where there's on-site packing. Right. So I would find it very interesting to understand or be able to have some kind of equivalent. I wonder if your study could do that, provide us with that distribution to see where value is captured in the value chain, in the wine grape sector, and also how it's shifted over time. Because the important point there was that it's supermarkets, and in that case it was 44% supermarkets, 44% of the value going to British supermarkets, but also it's that all of those intermediaries, it's the agents, the exporters, and so on, and that's where the bulk of the value is being captured. So I'd love to see some kind of equivalent coming out of your project that could help us to understand the differences in the distribution of value between wine and table grapes, and also to see the change over time. And I just wanted to add one thing on the farm workers schemes. So I thought that you were overly polite in your mention of the really quite scandalous kinds of track record in many, if not the majority of schemes, including the Vinpro. Vinpro did quite a major survey of all of the wine sector empowerment schemes some years ago. And it's really quite devastating to look not only at how much industry, but particularly how much public money has gone into schemes where the workers don't own the land. They own minority shares, they don't control decision making, they're not assured of jobs, they're not assured of tenure, as they can face job losses and eviction. And there's very little declaring of dividends. So I mean, the trade-off really in the 90s, at a time when the wine industry thought they were going to have to give up land, was, this is a highly capital intensive sector, surely it's better for the poor to have a share rather than land. And so the choice of land or share has ended up with neither, really. And not only that, job losses. And job losses both driven by the kind of market dynamics we described, and also apparently aggravated in part by minimum wages, etc. But the nature of labor has changed so much, and I would hope that you look at that as well. That increasingly South African wine farms can adhere to regulations for those who are employed.
Yeah.
But the character of that employment has shifted so much. So people being employed for fewer days per week, or a whole lot of the character of that employment. So yeah, thanks so much.
Sure.
We are running towards the end, but if they're having further questions. So what I will do is I just want to try to capture some of what has come from online as well, which has really been in a way anticipating and amplifying what Ruth has said. It almost goes back to your top left-hand square in your forms of inequality, looking at the forms of inequality within the node and the extent to which what we're talking about here is not only the conditions of labor on the farms, but we have the laborers being off the farms. One of the online participants asked to what extent you'll be engaging trade unions and workers' bodies as well in these discussions, so that labor relations are not only between the producers and the traders, but between the producers and the suppliers of labor as well. But with that, I'll leave it to the two of you to wrap up, and then we're really out of time, so we will have to close up after that. Thank you very much.
I mean, these are really, really good questions, and also very relevant challenges for our work. So part of the way in which we're portraying these kind of issues now is that we're trying to be careful because we haven't done the farm level work yet. Okay. So we are aware of all the previous work that has been done, and we also are aware of the very critical literature in this field, which we are engaging with. I am not familiar with the VIMPRO study. We actually asked VIMPRO for a record of their knowledge of these deals, but then there's also Savitu now that is focusing more on the entrepreneurial side, but I'm happy to hear that there's something about. In terms of the distribution of value along the chain, that is part of our remit. I mean, that's it's a classic sort of analysis of inequality in the value chain. So we will be doing that. I have data from 2005 on that, and we are gathering data to make a comparative analysis. I think that when it comes to within the node, and these issues have to do with farm labor conditions and trade unions, and that is more of what this other project will come into that. We have scratched a little bit on the labor union side, started. This is a sort of exploratory phase. So we're taking these, and thank you for pushing this.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Sorry.
No problem.
I think there are a few more things that maybe we should have from
Actually, not much.
Please go ahead.
Not much else. I just wanted to add that the understanding where the value is captured along the value chain and the distribution of value is definitely very important. And as Stefano was saying, we have another project at CRED for Oxfam South Africa, where we will be sort of going deeper at the farm level and understanding these dynamics a bit better, and how the nature of labor has changed will be part of that study as well. So thank you. Thanks for those very useful comments.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Stefano and Lina. Very productive. Thank you also to the online listeners who participated very fulsomely, even though they were not here. We look forward to hosting you on your return, and you will be telling us all the new and surprising things you found. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.